Good day, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of third-party risk management webinars. My name's Duncan Reid. I'm Marketing Manager at DVV Solutions. Today, we're delighted to be joined by our partner, Supplier Wisdom, to take a look at the emerging best practices and supporting technologies, helping organizations to better operationalize their supply chain assurance programs and improve resilience in the global supply chain. Just a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. To help reduce background noise and interference, we have placed all attendees on mute. There is, however, a Q&A session a little bit later on, so you can leave any notes in there and we'll try and pick up any questions as we go along, but we have dedicated 10 or 15 minutes towards the end to focus on that in particularly. This session is recorded and will be made available as soon as possible to everybody. Today, we do hope to provide a view of some of why traditional risk management practices are insufficient in ensuring resiliency in the supply chain, the importance and value in expanding your risk aperture beyond traditional cyber and financial risk, the opportunity and challenges of utilizing continuous monitoring, and how these various optics, technologies, and practices can be combined into an automated risk management process that's focused on effective and efficient risk actions and responses. With that, allow me to very briefly introduce our two speakers today. First of all, John Bree, CRO and Evangelist at Supply Wisdom. Prior to joining Supply Wisdom, John held senior positions in New York, Tokyo, Singapore, and London for Citi and Deutsche Bank, covering corporate, investment, commercial, and consumer banking operations. John's delivered cost-efficient and operationally effective risk management programs across the globe, ensuring compliance with local and global requirements. He's also a long-standing member of the Shared Assessments US and UK steering committees, and is co-chair of the Financial Industry Vertical Strategy Group. For those of you who don't know him, I also introduce Sean O'Brien, MD of DVV Solutions. Sean is a practicing certified third-party risk professional and assessor with over 25 years hands-on experience of delivering IT security and GRC managed services within highly regulated industries. As well as the day job, Sean is also a founding member of the EMEA Strategy and Steering Committee for the Shared Assessments Programme, and sits on the Best Practice Committee to provide a more Eurocentric view to developing the global standards and practices within the programme. If I can just set the scene for a moment, we all appreciate the expansion of outsourced operations, adoption of cloud and as-a-service models that continue to grow apace. While these can offer significant benefits of cost, scale, flexibility, this has led to a complex global web of interconnected people, processes, and data, many of which are potential weak links and backdoors into an organization's IT infrastructure and critical intellectual property and data. Traditional TPRM methodologies and practices have tended to focus on criticalities and suppliers based on size and spend, with skills and resources lagging behind the dynamic moving targets of financially motivated threat actors, but also the broader understanding of residual risk throughout the supply chain. In recent times, we've seen significant disruption, risk, and impact from a variety of external factors, whether that's high-profile supply chain attacks, cybersecurity breaches, the obvious impact of COVID-19 on the economy and day-to-day operations, fallout from Brexit on both sides of the channel, and the increasing regulatory scrutiny and governance and resilience of internal operations and within the supply chain. Which brings me to ask you, John, are off-the-shelf risk tools for the traditional cyber and financial risk analysis sufficient to get a full picture of third-party risk?
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you all for joining. I think along with my good friend Sean, we'll go through a lot of important factors today. But getting to that specific question, traditionally over the many years that I've been in this business, we always looked at cyber risk, which is still a very critical part of what we do on the risk management side, and financial risk. And we looked at this kind of at a high level with our third-party vendors. What's happening today is, number one, we need to expand even those categories, and you can just see from what's on the screen now how cybersecurity risk is covering up to 20 domains of interest, or key indicators, or categories, whichever you prefer. And on the financial risk side, we've gone beyond just a credit rating or a simple report, for example, that a company fills out and submits. So we're starting to look at these things. We're also looking at things in addition to a foundational assessment that's done, like using a SIG or something like that, we're now realizing that you have to do more continuous monitoring in these areas. And we're going to be transitioning now into a much broader area of monitoring, as we call it, widening the aperture and starting to look at really other categories. I think, Sean, you want to expand on that a little bit, some of this and some of the other categories that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, John, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So I think from a cyber risk perspective, John's absolutely correct. The expansion of the number of cyber risk domains that we're looking at, the advent of the Internet of Things, 5G, artificial intelligence are driving even more of those, and the overall risk landscape is changing and increasing with complexity almost on a day-by-day scale at the moment. Couple that with some of the points that Duncan's raised in relation to recent events, where, if we pick on particularly SolarWinds, that wouldn't have been a supplier that anybody was most likely to have as a critical or as a high risk supplier. I think they're far more likely to have had them as a medium risk and not really looked at the impacts that SolarWinds has caused or the subsequent fallout in and around the SolarWinds breach. And then the fact that the malware assessment tools from FireEye were also stolen, I think we'll see some significant net effects and impacts on that going forward over the next 12, 18 months as people start to obtain and use those tools and understand how they work and plan to avoid them. So we're likely to see more repercussions of events like that. And the issue has been that most organizations are focused very much on the comet and not particularly on the tail. And what I mean by that is that they've focused very much on the criticals and the highs, but they've failed to spend too much time looking at the mediums and the lows. And I think it's fair to say that, given the recent events, the risks are right the way across the full spectrum there. So that's one side of it, John. And then the other side, I think, really is, particularly on the back of COVID, financial risk is just not enough anymore. An awful lot of organisations in the UK, in Europe, and globally are struggling financially, and it's quite difficult to just look at those financials, all right, and gain a good understanding of what's going on with a particular supplier. Cash flow and liquidity are obviously the key areas that organisations want to look at from a financial perspective. But when you start looking at other implications, whether the customer base is increasing or decreasing, whether the profit and the turnover figures per employee are increasing or decreasing. What are the cash reserves like for those organisations? What's the customer retention rates? What about in terms of, have there been any significant changes in the senior management team? All these are indicators that because financial information is typically produced quarterly if you're a PLC or yearly if you're a private limited company, are past historic, much the same as a questionnaire or on-site assessment at a point in time. There's been an ever-increasing need to drive towards more continuous monitoring and more near real-time information to be able to understand and be able to be on top of the risks that your organisation's facing.
Thanks, guys. So if we start to expand that view or risk aperture, as we might reference it, and look at those broader risk vectors, why and how are compliance officers bringing ESG into third-party due diligence programs? I'll pitch that to Sean, I guess.
Thank you, Duncan. So yeah, ESG is definitely the three-letter abbreviation for 2021. Not just from the US joining the Paris Climate Accord again, and John Kerry starting to drive that home from a US and a broad perspective, but also from a legislative perspective. So we're starting to see some major changes within organisations from a political level, and also equally as important, an investment level. So ESG can mean many things to many people, and there are a lot of discussion papers out there around what ESG is, what is and isn't included. But I think more importantly, it's probably the World Economic Forum latest discussion papers, but detail the categories and how to measure it. So I think first of all, the standardization of how to measure ESG and what to measure and what that means to a business is a really important place. So if anybody wants some links to those papers, all right, please let me know and we'll forward the links over. But equally, at the same time, we've also seen a discussion paper come out towards the end of last year from the European Banking Association, talking about ESG categories and risks and linking to the World Economic Forum ratings proposals as well. So first of all, we're seeing a lot of drives because of climate change from a government level, both in the UK, Europe, and also in the US now as well. But equally, the other side of that is that we've started to see some major global investment firms start to only invest in green funds and green businesses. And an awful lot of investment firms and funds jumping on that bandwagon. There's a new phrase that I discovered the other week called greenwash, which is apparently an investment fund pretending to be ESG based or climate based, but not really. All right, investing in some traditional fossil fuel organisations as well. So there's a whole raft of changings happening, not just from a global political and human perspective, but also from an investment management side of things. So that these two things coming together are going to make some very significant changes in the landscape. So I think it's only fair that you as an organization need to know how to measure your own environmental, social governance position and risk you're facing. But equally, the knock-on effect is that because we all outsource an ever increasing amount of processes to third parties, fourth parties, nth parties, how do we begin to look at those and measure those as well, either at a contractual negotiation stage or back prior to that, or even on an ongoing basis? And so we're starting to see a rise in those kind of metrics, particularly with organizations who are very much ethically driven at this moment in time, but it's starting to ripple down into a lot of the large global players as well already.
Thanks, Sean. Moving on, John, I know a subject that's that you've commented on quite recently. What about, if we think about one of the biggest operational impacts that's happened to all organizations and COVID-19 and the work from home impact? What are you starting to see? What kind of conversations are starting to happen in terms of understanding? Obviously, that's part of a broader operational risk issue in terms of preparations and understanding not only the risk and opportunities within your own organization, but within the supply chain of the impact of new working practices.
Sure. Thanks, Doug. And let me expand a little bit on what Sean said as I kind of answer that topic. Sean talked about the expanding aperture, looking at more things. You have to have a better understanding, and that understanding cannot be once a year or once every 2 years. You need to have this continuous risk intelligence that allows you to identify changes that are happening, as well as trends. What we've learned is that, for example, we did a look back on a project on a target client that we monitor who had a cyber incident. And when we looked back over a 2-year period, we actually identified deteriorations in all of the categories. In other words, we saw financial deterioration. We saw them having large turnover, losing leadership, changes at their staff level, a huge attrition rate, financial, I mentioned sanctions, lawsuits. So what happens is all of these deteriorations in subcategories, and the subcategories you see here go down into hundreds and hundreds of key indicators that help compile that risk and show that deterioration. Sometimes it has management, as we say, take their eye off the ball, or they have to divert funding away from certain things, maybe even controls, into just managing the challenges they're facing. So that's kind of another part of this. You also then have to realize, as you look further down the supply chain, and we look at it two ways. We look at a supply chain being sort of an inbound, where it's maybe the 4 or 5 subcontractors that you have in order to develop a product, right? Everything from raw material right up the line. So now you look at the equatorial principles that financial institutions are following. you have to have an understanding that no one in your supply chain has any of these ESG or compliance risk issues. The same when you're on the sourcing side, and Sean will talk a little more about that, but when you're sourcing, you're now taking data that's been entrusted to you, you're sending it places to be processed. You can't wait till once a year or every other year to find out if whoever's touching that data is still meeting all the requirements and is still as strong as they were when you started the program. So I think those are some of the other things. The third piece of this is really location risk. If we learned anything with the pandemic, was that a lot of companies didn't understand where their service was being provided from. So when vendors came back and said, oh, we're just going to go work from home. Well, you need to understand what work from home or work from any place is. I think I've learned that from you, Sean, is. In other words, if you're doing that, from central London or New York City, is, well, you pretty much are going to have power, you're going to have connectivity, you're going to have a strong infrastructure. What about countries that don't have that capability? Think about all the countries that emerging markets that we went to, because labor was less expensive, because real estate was less expensive. Well, part of the problem there is that when you leave that central facility where your service was being provided from, and people start to work from home, all the controls that you had about the system, the location, people card in, they card out, all of that stuff is gone. Everybody in a room, in a facility, well, they're authorized to see the data. That changes when you're working from home or a library or a cafe. So I think a lot of the controls, and I know, Sean, you're going to talk a little more about this, have to change. So we got to rethink all this, and our control environment, which is the basis of governance and risk, has to be as agile as everything else we're doing. So I think that's where we have to look at this. And is the more data, and there's one other comment I want to make, is that I've said this repeatedly to a lot of my friends, to the point of annoying them. It used to be the risk of not knowing. The new risk is knowing and not acting. And I think that's something we all have to think about. Intelligence must be actionable. Sean?
Just a couple of points to expand on things you've mentioned there, John, before I kind of move on. So I think location risk is already being impacted partly through COVID, so I totally agree with that. But I think equally privacy is driving that as well. Where's your data being accessed from? Who's accessing it? Not just in terms of the primary data center where it's being processed, but where are those people accessing it from? And as you quite rightly point out, home or anywhere. But also in terms of what's the privacy legislation in the locations it's being stored and also being accessed from. So there's an ever increasing amount of privacy load there as well, and again that's on a continuous basis. And then the flip side of that is also from a location risk perspective, in terms of organizational resilience, or operational resilience. A lot of legislation coming through, John, both in the UK and EMEA, and starting to move over to the US around looking at your critical applications and what if they fail and where do they fail to, and again location being a critical element of that. So there's really a lot of offset of the primary categories we're looking at there against location risk on many different levels. And certainly something we've talked about before in terms of not just, for example, a COVID impact and people working from home, but as you then very nicely alluded to, what if there's a local power outage as well, so your remote workers can't access and do their job. So cascade risk across these multiple domains is very much a real-time or near real-time requirement. So I just wanted to add those points. I think really, how do you pull all this data together? How do you start to consume it, to understand it? Because we've certainly seen from a cyber perspective a vast amount of data, and the more risks, the more you've got to be seen to be doing something with those risks. So what sort of methods are in place? Where do those methods go? How do you gain some structure? How do you gain some maturity about pulling this information in? So Duncan, if you could move to the next slide, please. So really, we're looking at a structure of all of this information coming in, being assessed, deciding what needs to be done on it, tracking and agreeing with the third, fourth, fifth end parties on what needs to be done, an agreed timescale, and ensuring that's done. All right, and effectively we equate that to what we call a risk operating center, a ROC, which is effectively merely a simple extension of your security operations center, and that you know, although in this instance he's covering very much a third party angle, all right, it could be utilized for anything. So looking at all of this information, looking at where it's going, looking at what it means, the potential impacts are very much where local legislation around operational resiliency for financials in the UK market is absolutely targeted. And just the ever increasing number of risk domains coming in really having an impact on your third party teams. So from my perspective, standing back and looking at whether you've just got a cyber risk third party team or whether you're going to adopt and include these additional risk domains, you know, whether privacy is reviewed separately, financial risk is reviewed separately, who owns the overall risk and what's the structure and how does that look like, are really important questions you should be asking yourselves at this stage.
You know, staying with this slide for a minute and expanding on that, what you have is, and we, you know, risk operations, and we call it a listening post. I mean, that's another term that we've used. And basically what we're saying is that in an organization, basically small, medium-sized, large organizations, they're all the same. We have to think about what we call, you know, we all talk about silos and breaking silos. We you know, make it a little sexier and we call it cross vertical. And the reason we call it cross vertical is that we want all the different verticals in a company, both on the business side and on the operational functional side, to kind of be involved. And you really have three ways you're going to sort of get information. It's going to come from your internal notifications. Things happen, problems occur, or you may have an audit finding, you might have a, you know, a regulatory finding, but that's sort of internal, you're getting that. Then you have all these external risk feeds that we were talking about earlier, covering, you know, an extensive group of third-party risk, you know, covering financial right through nth party, and then the whole location side, right? And then the third piece of this, which becomes more available as you start to continuously monitor and bring in knowledge, is you can actually do predictive analytics. Think about the fact that people say, well, we've never done that in third-party risk, but we've done it, especially in the banking and marketing industries. We've been doing this for years. That's how we determine how people are going to spend. We look at what their buying habits are. In credit risk, we've been doing this. God, I've been in banking most of my career. We've been tracking credit risk and doing forecasting for years. We don't wait till a credit client misses a payment. We start to look at, are there other challenges? What's going on in the marketplace? What's happening in regions? Is unemployment up or down? So we look at all these things. We can do the same in third-party risk. When you think about all these categories of information, you can actually look for trends and behavior patterns. Now, when that comes together, it should go into a central point where it can be validated and then, as Sean said, you know, distributed through the organization properly. And think about some of the little things, and we talk about sharing this across, you know, the business. You know, someone will say, well, gee, you know, we're in banking and we're a lending institution. Are we really concerned about a location issue? Well, if you're in trade finance, you are, because if ports are shut down due to an issue in a country, and we've financed that ship that has product on it, that's sitting in the harbor. Unless that ship gets in and unloads, our trade finance deal is going into trouble because we based it on a timeline. So you start to think about these kind of things, and you start to think about, well, maybe we need to share that, you know, whether it's an M&A deal, whether it's a credit deal, whatever it is, other parts of your organization can benefit from this knowledge that you're bringing, this retail risk information that you're bringing in. I think we explained it a little more on the next slide. So I think, Sean, you wanted to kind of go through that, some of the steps, and show how similar they are to a security operations center dealing with maybe just a cyber issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this slide talks us. I was just talk you through it really. So in terms of the overall issues, all right, we're looking at trying to create a sound listening post that's going to give you near real-time risk intelligence. So the first point is that you need a single pane of glass view of these multiple disparate risk domains, all right? Because although different teams within your organization may have different drivers, all right, ultimately the business process owner needs to understand the overall risk picture for the business process they own and in some perspective they're liable for. So it's really important that, you know, rather than having lots and lots and lots of different applications with lots of different information, and the most important point there, with lots of different metrics that you then need to normalize to be able to measure accurately, what we're looking at doing is bringing all of that together, single pane of glass view, all right, still meeting the criteria for different departments to look at different pieces of risk, but very much giving an overall picture for the business in a uniform way. So, you know, we're looking at that information, pulling that information in about a particular supplier, being able to measure that supplier and that performance over time in terms of the trends. We're also looking at integrating that with some of the other side of things. So how do you pull this near real-time information in? How do you pull in the risks from, as John very rightly pointed out, you know, the supplier relationship manager may have some particular performance issues or KPI issues. The questionnaire may have raised something, or the on-site or virtual on-site may have raised something. So we need to be able to integrate this into, you know, however you're managing your ongoing questionnaire and point-in-time assessment processes. You need to be able to collate all of this information to be able to assess the risk and then be able to pass the appropriate risk back up the food chain from your third-party risk management program into your enterprise risk management program, and equally bring that information, you know, where your risk appetite and your thresholds are being dictated at a business level back down through that ARM program and into this program as well. So hence the API interfaces are really important for the supply wisdom platform. And all of that enables you to make some really well-defined and equally as important, documented risk decisions based on a structured set of analysis, all right, that are using exactly the same metrics. So in terms of that, it really allows you to mature your program out into a much more structured framework. It allows you to measure much more accurately and give much more precise and repeatable information to the business process owners and the senior management team on an ongoing basis. All right, so really a really important set of controls that really allow you to grow and mature your program significantly. Anything you want to add there, John?
Yeah, it's. I think, Duncan, you mentioned earlier, or Sean mentioned about the World Economic Forum. What's really interesting in their report, the last report for the 2021, of the top risks by likelihood and by impact, the vast majority, 9 out of 10, 8 out of 10, are all location and environmentally related. A lot of the things, cyber it was only one in top risk by likelihood. Cybersecurity failure was basically only 1 in 10. That's pretty interesting. Something to think about, because even the World Economic Forum is realizing that we have other impacts. The other thing I want to mention, Sean, is that about the feedback loop, and we've talked about this, and you've lectured me on this a couple of times, and it's about, you know, taking that data, taking everything you learn, and then once you've dealt with the issue, feed that back in, because what that does is that should change the front end of how you're looking at things happening. Because once you've dealt with a problem successfully, you've probably modified a control. Well, if you've modified a control, you might have adjusted the risk. You know, do you need to adjust the risk appetite now that you have a better control? Or have you realized that you're going to have a control challenge that there's nothing you can do about? For example, you know, working from anywhere. You can't deal with the weather. You have to learn to live with it. So maybe what you need to do is change your risk aperture or your risk appetite to say, you know something, we're going to take a harder look at something maybe sooner than we would in the past. So that's the importance of the feedback loop and taking what you learn. So this is a living process, a living document, so to say, that you're constantly updating it. And I think that is a real important lesson I know we've learned that, and I know I learned that, over my time in the business, back even when we were running, anti-fraud programs. We used to look at behavior patterns, and we started to realize that we had to look at the little things, because sometimes it's the little things that are a precursor to the big things. And where we're going in this industry is we're actually moving from kind of descriptive as to where we are with awareness, and we're starting to move into diagnostic and predictive, and then eventually prescriptive. So where we're taking the data we have, the knowledge we have, and we're actually using it to anticipate problems, forecast problems, try and get prevention and avoidance to its maximum level, because a great avoidance and prevention program is a lot more important and a lot more is more financially viable and beneficial than having a great response program. So we need to get on the front end of these things. And one last thing, and again, we've talked about this. In order to do this, you need to make sure that those of you that are involved in risk and third-party risk are at the front of the system design lifecycle as programs are being developed, whether it's a new product or a new program or a new process. You need to get in at the beginning so you can identify early on what some of the risk challenges are, and you can work with the various business and functional units to kind of build a control in up front so that you can reduce that, because the more you do on the front end, the less you do on the back end. And I know my friend and partner is going to want to talk about this one, Sean.
So I think in terms of certainly the back end side of things, my favorite subject really is the part of that feedback loop, John, is very much making sure that you're working with procurement and working with legal to ensure that the findings and the risk reduction are impacted and ripple across back to your security due diligence at a contract level. Because one instance, there's a lot of effort involved in fixing it, but if you can then learn from that lesson and apply that to your standardized contracts going forward, you're not going to make that same mistake again. You're not going to have to expend that same amount of energy again, going back out again. So I think that's really important from my perspective. I think really the overall scope of how you adopt this kind of technology is really important, and understanding where everything fits within your own political landscape. So how is your organization dealing with third-party risk? What level of involvement of procurement got, of legal got, of privacy got, of information security got? Is it a centralized model? Is it a decentralized model? Is it a federated model? Who owns risk and what's the risk escalation processes? How are you tied into your ERM metrics in terms of, as we touched on, risk appetite and risk tolerances, ideally by risk domain? All that building out and maturing the framework make the implementation of these kind of technologies and these kind of services much, much easier. And there are lots of organizations on this call with lots of different levels of maturity. So what I would advocate really is that pick up the phone, let's have a very simple conversation about where you are, and let us look at where you can start, how you can start to progress down this particular route, all right, and how you can start to mature and start to evidence some real value across this ever-increasing threat landscape.
Okay, thanks, guys. We have obviously set a bit of time aside for Q&A. I do have some questions that were provided in advance. But before we move into that, is there anything you just want to cover off before we move on? Any?
I just think it's important that and I think Sean mentioned this earlier on, with all this new capabilities, these advanced capabilities of having a lot of intelligence and risk information, you have to have it in a manageable format. You can't keep pulling it in from multiple sources like a lot of us have done over the years. You really need to have this in, as we call it, a single pane, where you can look across your vendor portfolio and immediately identify where a risk is. You can look at a specific vertical within a portfolio. Okay, how am I AD&M vendors doing, or how am I back office settlement vendors doing? And I think those kind of things are important. You also need to think about, as we talk, and everybody's talking a lot about nth party, fourth party to nth party, that's great. It's nice to know that, I mean, Cognizant, which is a great firm, right? That, they might have, 200 different subcontractors that they work with and they use for support. Well, that's great. But when I was at Citibank and Deutsche Bank, I would say, well, good, but I want to know which one is touching my data. I want to know who's touching my stuff and where is my stuff going. So you really need to start to think about, when you work with your vendors, ask them these questions. Who else is doing it? What's my chain? Identify that chain. I go way back, and some of us are old enough to remember Sarbanes-Oxley in the US. We had to know, I got you laughing on that one. We had to know every touch point of an asset from the minute it came in the front door of the bank to the left of the bank. And all of a sudden people started to say, oh my God, I didn't realize that, it went from Citibank in North America to Citibank in Mumbai to HCL in Dalian, China. And all of a sudden the regulators came and say, yeah, you really need to know that. You got to know that. And so we have to start thinking about those things. Don't try and boil the ocean. Start slow. But as you're interfacing with your vendor partners, start to ask these questions. And I know DVV has support documents that can help you lay this out. They have a program that we've been sharing with them called Target Profile that allows you to actually plot this out. And it's relatively simple. It'll take a little time, but you don't have to. If you have, oh my God, I have 1,000 vendors. Well, okay, we'll do them one at a time. Let's do the top 50. So that's something to think about. And I think that's where you don't hesitate to ask a partner. Don't hesitate to, reach out to DVV or Supply Wisdom and say, I heard this bald-headed guy say this stuff. How do I do that? I mean, he made it sound so simple. How do I do that stuff? So that's kind of an important piece of this, Duncan and Sean, before we move on to the next one.
I agree, John. I think keep it simple is always the best standard. Nth party, there's an awful lot of discussion around nth party at the moment. My advice is ask your third party. All right, who else is touching my data, as you quite rightly point out. It doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be a big complex questionnaire set. There's shared assessments of a very nice little target data tracker, which I think is still free of charge. That allows you to ask those questions, track that information through third, fourth, fifth, nth parties. It's not a complex process. It can be a time-consuming process, and keeping on top of it can be a time-consuming process. But the great advantage with near real-time monitoring tools is that you don't need a right to audit. So whereas with a questionnaire or an on-site assessment, you're unlikely to be able to carry out those assessment processes for fourth, fifth, sixth parties, what you can do is you can use these tools to be able to monitor those fourth, fifth, sixth parties without any contractual requirements, and not just fourth, fifth, sixth nth parties, but your business partners, where you're entering into joint investments, where you're monitoring your competitors, where you want to look at, you're not particularly happy with your current supplier and you want to monitor for a while their nearest 2 or 3 other competitors, so you're not jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, so to speak. There are lots and lots of ways you can use these tools to really add value to the business. Pre-merger and acquisition, monitoring potential targets. During merger and acquisition, post-merger and acquisition, all right? The list goes on and on where you can use, and my all-time favorite is, what happens when you terminate a relationship, but the supplier still has residual data of yours because they need it for warranty or for accounting purposes for the next 7 years or whatever. How on earth do you monitor that? So there are lots and lots of rationales here where you can use this kind of information, these kind of tools, to really get a much better understanding of the risk position you're in, and really help advise the business and to better meet the strategy of the organization.
Okay, thank you. Duncan, are we ready for our next one? I think we're jumping across into questions now.
Yeah. You'd already touched, I think you'd half answered most of one of the questions, which was around nth party risk. So I'll have to paraphrase more in terms of how can, if we think about that ROC model, how can that be automated and quantified in terms of the nth party risk?
Well, I think when you look at, you know, the ROC model that we talked about, which is sort of an end-to-end, you know, monitoring, multi-category open aperture monitoring tool, and it's a monitoring to action tool, which is important to understand. They're on workflow. I mean, a lot of companies have workflow tools. The object is not to have to build something new if you have a good workflow tool. Think about anyone who's had dealt with or been exposed to their AML teams or their fraud teams on the banking side. You know, we've been doing this for a long time. Start with a case, it processes through a system, different people get involved in it. You know, you might identify a problem and you realize that it's, you know, it's maybe a financial issue with a third-party service provider. Well, if there was a fraud case involving finance, you'd go to your finance department and you'd say, can you guys help us with this? Well, that's something you might want to do. So if you have a workflow tool, whatever that may be, and there's a ton of good ones out there, you know, and you might be using it for something else, you might be able to adapt it. I mean, that's what, you know, I mean, I know companies like DVV do that all the time. They help you take the tools you have and expand them to do other things. Because remember, this is really only information. That front end, that risk intelligence, that little group in the left-hand corner, that's where it comes in, and then you create, quote unquote, a case or an incident. And then it goes through a case management system or an incident management system. So don't think that this is, you know, overly complicated. You can start manual. You can start with a very simple manual system and then kind of use the other tools that are out there. So that's something, again, don't hesitate to reach out and ask.
Equally, if you're struggling with any of this, John, you know, we're more than happy to be able to provide resources, to be able to provide training, to augment the team for a short period of time, or indeed outsource the whole thing. Obviously, the one thing you can't outsource is risk in its entirety. However, we're more than happy to help in whatever way possible. This is not an overnight change. You know, this is not even a 6, 9, 12 months. You know, this is a 12, 18 months, 2 years to reach some level of maturity. So, you know, find the right partner that you trust, all right, that you will spend the time with you to get you where you need to go.
Good point. Good point. I think together we've built what's called risk analysis as a service, where we actually go to our you know, clients and we say to them, they say, great, I want all this new data. And then they say, oh my God, what am I going to do with it? Well, as Sean said, we provide that support to get you on the road. So we'll do it for you, then we'll show you how to do it, and then eventually you'll do it. So again, don't hesitate. Ask a lot of questions.
And to that point, John, only this morning we were on a call with a European bank presenting their quarterly benchmark, all right, to their senior man, to their C-suite. So, you know, we're not just talking about this risk analysis as a service. We're deeply embedded in organizations and you know, undertaking the risk assessment and the advisory right the way up to board level with organizations. So this is not something that is brand new. This is something that we're actually doing on a day-to-day basis.
You know,
okay, thanks, guys.
You know, Duncan, an important thing to remember,
Sean.
Well, Sean, you just touched on it. While we're not here to overly sell you, and we're selling you on ideas and concepts.
Yeah.
When you reach out to that partner, chances are that partner may be providing a similar service to a peer group or another part of an industry. You now get the input beyond your problem into a broader area. So in other words, if you know, DVV has you know, a lot of clients, well, when they talk to you, they're talking about your problem, but they're bringing all this experience together. When you talk to Supply Wisdom, we talk about your risk parameters, but we can also bring together what is happening in other parts of your industry as well as other industries. So by using your DVV partnership, you know, you get a vast amount of knowledge. You get all the DVV, you get all the Supply Wisdom right through your DVV relationship.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, John. And frequently to give a lot of weight to what we talk about, organizations do struggle to move some of these things forward and gain initiatives within the business. So it's really simple, and it's a terrible human trait. But if you were to say that your nearest competitor was already doing this, I think you get a whole much better response from the senior management team. All right. And I can see you smiling and nodding there, John. All right. We've both been through that on numerous occasions. All right. So, we're able to bring information about your peers as well. Obviously not specifics, that would be a breach of confidence, but in terms of what the industry is doing, where it's up to, who your nearest rivals are, as a general statement, what they're doing and why they're doing and the results they're seeing from it. And in some instances, yes, we can set up a conversation between organisations as well, where it's appropriate and everybody's happy to do so. Sorry, Duncan, we interrupt.
No. I was just trying to get a few more questions in. So we've had one, probably a little bit more operational. Which framework or frameworks would you suggest are most applicable for a TPRM program? Oh,
that's a good question. So I think most traditional cyber organizations will be looking in ISO 27001 as a primary framework. If you're more US side, then NIST is pretty prevalent over there. All right, although increasing more on this side of the pond as well. I can say from experience that ISO 27001 has an almost infamous test and only small amount of information about third-party risk in it. NIST is improving significantly over the past 2 years, and there are some sections on best practice and what you should be doing. But ultimately, although I think I'm pretty biased, and John probably is as well, I would look to shared assessments as the kind of de facto standard there in terms of frameworks and guidance around third-party risk. I would view them very much as the thought leaders in this industry. But, hand on heart and being very open and honest about that, I am heavily involved, as John is, with shared assessments at various committees. We do practice what we preach, John. So.
Yeah, peer groups are very important. So take a look at that, the shared assessments. We run a program along with our partners called Risk Board, where we have peer-to-peer conversations of senior folks who talk, on the Chatham House rules, and you learn a lot. We're actually expanding that into a European version. Sean, I know you're working with us on that. So we got a couple of really good things happening, but there's a lot of information out there. The only dumb question is the one you don't ask.
Yep, absolutely. And I think, from a framework perspective, I think a lot of it depends on the regulation landscape that you're in and the vertical market you're in, Duncan. So as ever, the answer you hate me giving is it depends. All right, but it does. But ultimately, you're looking for a framework that can meet multiple regulations. So, and hence looking at something like the shared assessment side of things, the SIG and the SCA, because they bridge, NIST and New York DFS and ISO 27001 and PCI DSS and GDPR and save you a whole massive time in that area. But certainly a lot of that is point in time orientated around questionnaire and on-site, or virtual on-site assessments. But it's equally applicable to what we're doing here on the continuous monitoring side of things as well.
Okay, thanks. Another question in terms of looking for the best risk metrics and information that I should be providing the board.
Do you want me to kick off that one, John?
Yeah.
Okay. So
go ahead, take that one.
Thank you. I would always adopt a really practical perspective. So I would first of all try and understand the route to the board that the information needs to travel, because you're wanting to deliver predominantly, cyber risk information, IT risk information, but as we're talking about now, it's broadening out significantly. And the board doesn't really speak IT risk, it speaks business risk. So I would, start to look at some standards around things like FAIR and how you're doing, quantitative risk metrics at scale. But I would look at the route, from you and your team up to the C-suite and who you're delivering that information to, and if who that individual is on the board, how long they've been on the board, are they able to present the information and what works for them? Real simple questions like, how many slides do you want? All right, what level of detail do you want? So if there is a defined risk appetite and tolerances, how do you want to present anything that's going outside of those tolerances, or what the trends are? And really have that conversation with the senior management person. For me, ideally, probably the CRO, because they've been on the board for a long time. They're a very recognized figure, a lot of respect from the other board members, and they can speak business risk fluently. If it's going up through a CIO or a CISO to a board level, it tends to be very IT orientated, and it tends to be IT risk, and it needs to be translated into potential likelihood and potential financial impact are the two metrics the board only really want to hear. So I would understand the route. I would understand the people in respect of that route, and really look at what it is that level of the organisation need to know and understand. There'll be lots of other layers that you need to present your information to. Yesterday and today, we were working on reporting for a quarterly meeting for supplier relationship managers. And, that's a completely different set of metrics that they want to understand than it is to a broad board risk committee. All right. So again, that's back down to the basics, understanding the audience you're going to be presenting information to, find out what's important to them, and ensure that, what you're presenting is appropriate, both in terms of content and in terms of volume of data as well. One little tip, sorry, John, sorry to interrupt you. One point I would try and avoid is you tend to find that discussions go off at a tangent if you're mentioning a specific supplier. So while you do need to do that, at a general presentation level, try and avoid it, because you'll get the message across rather than allowing them to disappear down the rabbit hole and talk about the detail, a particular incident. So just be cautious about mentioning your supplier names at the most senior level, unless it's absolutely necessary to give context to what you're stating.
Good points. And I think, Sean, I think you hit them all. I remember early in my career, and I had a mentor who was a president of a bank. His name was Desmond McDonald. And rest his soul, Des was the one that really got me started on my career. And I was doing my first presentation to a board, and I came in with this great deck of slides. And, he told me I only had like about, 30 seconds to get their attention. And I presented, and I talked about all the great stuff we were doing in loss avoidance and, asset protection, and how many, the good surveys and this, and with 98%, 94%, 93%, all the great stuff we were doing. And I remember one of the board members said, "John, that's fabulous. Tell me about the 3% that's not working."
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
And I learned that early on in my career. So in other words, don't tell me about all the good stuff. I want to know about where you're having a problem and how can I help you solve that problem. So
exactly.
Always be prepared for that one.
And it's back to, if you're looking at outsourcing to a cloud service provider and they've got a 99.8% uptime. Okay, so how many hours is the 0.2% actually equate to? How long am I going to be out of business for if that goes down? All right, that's the only, and that's exactly the same analogy, really. All right, maybe we've just been doing this for too long. We're too cynical, John.
All right, thanks. Duncan, back to you.
Yeah, one last one, conscious of time, so we'll try and squeeze this in. Do less critical suppliers need continuous monitoring, or can they be on periodic assessment program?
That's a great question. I think given SolarWinds as a prime example, I think that every supplier needs to be monitored to some degree. I appreciate it's about risk, and your risk model should be about proportionality. It's frequently about budget and resource availability, so those are realities as well. However, if you haven't monitored them or done an assessment of them and they do cause a breach, I would suggest that's your neck on the line. So either gain, again, as part of the framework, a clear definition of what level of monitoring you should be doing for each risk tier or risk category of supplier, to make sure that you're covering your backside, for want of a better phrase. But equally, my opinion is you should be monitoring everybody to some extent.
I think expanding on that, Sean, you hit a good point. You know, whoever your risk intelligence service provider or providers are, they should have the opportunity, give you the opportunity to adjust the topics you want or the categories you want to cover and the cadence at which you want to cover them. Some companies say, I want to know, I want to real time. I got to know everything that's going on because this is critical. But if your vendor has an RTO of maybe a week or 3 or 4 days, you might have to monitor them monthly or quarterly. Some you look at once a year and only look for negative information. So that's where you work with your risk intelligence provider, like at Supply Wisdom. We do that. It's menu driven. What do you want to look at? When do you want to look at it? How often do you want to see it? So, and that's important. And then it also has to be flexible enough that when you start to identify a problem, you have to be, agile enough to pivot and modify that monitoring program. It's not one and done. This is life cycle management. And that's something to, it's about from the time it starts till the time it ends, you have to be paying attention, but the right attention.
I think so. A great answer, John. I think it's absolutely superb. And yeah, it's back down to the basics of, scoping the supplier. Where do you perceive the risks are in relation to the supplier, and looking at what metrics are appropriate to that service that's being delivered, and frequency of assessment, be it continuous monitoring or periodic monitoring or point in time monitoring. What point very well made.
Like you do for your clients. I mean, you use monitoring to do targeted assessments.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I'm seeing a deterioration in a category, I don't have to ask questions about the other 10 categories. I'm going to ask questions about that category.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's where DVV helps you with the way they design those kind of programs.
Okay, thanks, guys. I'm very conscious of time, so we'd like to try and wrap things up. What are the key takeaways you'd both like people to take away from today's session, and where can we point people towards to go to next?
Don't hesitate to ask.
I would agree totally. Everybody's risk profile is different, Duncan, and so really what I would advocate is a conversation. All right. As John quite rightly points out, while we can provide a vast array of services and across a huge number of risk domains, and ever increasing number of risk domains, where are you now? Where do you want to start? What's the politics like? What's the budgets like? What's the tone at the top within your organization? All of those things have significant impact on what we can provide and how we can provide it and when we can provide it. So it all starts with that conversation. But all of those things are really important. But we've got to be realistic. We've got to live in the real world of the constraints that you have within your business.
Okay, thank you very much. In terms of next steps, we do have a few recommended resources that we would like to point people towards. John has recently written a blog specifically around the return to the workplace and the issues in there. John, do you want to give a quick précis on that one?
We've been hearing a lot about that, and I was on a webinar, and people were talking about it, and I said, what if they say no? What happens if people just say, I'm not coming back to the workplace? I don't care if I'm vaccinated and they clean the tube every, night. I'm not riding that tube. I'm not riding that train. So I think we have to deal with that. I think it's going to be going forward. And then CRO Wisdom is a program that we run where we actually interview risk leaders around the world, and we post it, and we ask them questions, that you people are asking and we're hearing about. So those are good resources.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Well, can I thank Sean and John for your input there. Thank you everybody for attending. We have recorded this session, so it will be made available very soon. We'll also be sending a follow-up email. But if there is any third-party risk management challenge, anything that we've discussed today that you'd like to understand a little bit more about, feel free to reach out and contact Sean on any of these contacts. Follow us on LinkedIn. And on Twitter, and our website is always there as a core resource. So thank you everybody, stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you again soon on our next event. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, John.